You've been the strong one for so long, you've almost forgotten that's a decision you made, and a performance you've been keeping up ever since. Think about the last time someone called you in a crisis. The adult child who needed money and couldn't ask anyone else. The friend whose marriage was ending. The colleague who didn't know how to handle it. You handled it. You said the right things. You held the shape of the conversation together until the other person felt steadier. And then you hung up, or drove home, or closed the office door, and you sat there, completely empty with nobody to call. That emptiness isn't weakness. It isn't burnout in the clinical sense, though it might feel like it. It's the cost of a very specific kind of labor. The labor of maintaining a self that other people can rely on. And it has been running in most people who carry it for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Long enough that it no longer feels like a role. It feels like who you are. T.S. Eliot named this in 1915, not as a self-help problem, as a poem. And the line he wrote is still the most precise description of this particular exhaustion in the English language. He called it preparing a face to meet the faces that you meet. The poem is called The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and if you haven't read it, the title is already a small deception. There is no love song, and Prufrock never does the thing he spends the whole poem deciding whether to do. What the poem actually is 100 lines inside the mind of a man getting ready to go to a party. Not a particularly dramatic party. A social gathering. Polite conversation, teacups, women coming and going. And the entire poem is Prufrock's interior monologue as he prepares himself, rehearsing what he might say, imagining how he'll be seen, measuring the distance between who he is and who the room will require him to be. That's where the line lives. There will be time. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. Read it slowly. Eliot isn't describing someone who's being fake, he's describing something more ordinary and more costly than fakery. He's describing the work of social calibration, the constant, low-level labor of reading a room and adjusting yourself to what it needs. The slightly different version of you that shows up at church versus the version that shows up at your son's house for Sunday lunch, versus the version that appears at the doctor's office or the quarterly review. Each of them is you, and each of them costs something. Prufrock is not a villain. He's not even particularly neurotic by most standards. He's just a man who has become so skilled at presenting the right face that he can no longer locate the one underneath. He's worried about his thinning hair. He wonders whether he dares to eat a peach. He has, he tells us, measured out his life with coffee spoons, one small managed moment at a time, until the small managed moments are all there is. That line, coffee spoons, is the one that stays. Because it's not a metaphor for failure. Prufrock hasn't done anything wrong, he's done everything right, by the standards of the world he lives in. The coffee spoons are the measure of a life organized around what other people see. A life in which the performance has become the substance. And the exhaustion in the poem isn't dramatic, it's quiet. It's the exhaustion of someone who is very good at this and no longer remembers why he started. Here is what you may not know about the man who wrote that poem. In 1917, 2 years after Prufrock was published, T.S. Eliot took a job at Lloyd's Bank in London. He wore a suit. He arrived on time. He processed loan documents and kept the accounts of foreign clients, and was, by all reports, a model employee, precise, reliable, never out of place. His colleagues liked him. His superiors trusted him. And every evening, and on weekends, and in the minutes he could steal during lunch, he wrote the poetry that would define the 20th century. He was performing two selves simultaneously. The competent banker who held the job down and the household together and managed the increasingly severe mental illness of his wife, Vivienne, and the poet who was trying to write the truth about what it cost to hold everything together. The gap between those two selves was the engine of the work. And it was also slowly and then quickly killing him. By 1921, he was done. Not dramatically done, not a public collapse, not a scandal, just the quiet failure of the mechanism. He'd been managing Vivienne's illness, managing his career, managing his reputation, managing the face he showed to the literary world. And one morning, he simply couldn't. He went to a specialist who sent him to a sanatorium in Lausanne, Switzerland. He was 33 years old. What happened in Lausanne is one of the more remarkable facts in literary history, not because it was triumphant, but because it was honest. In the rest, and the removal from performance in the weeks when nobody needed the competent version of him, something else came through. He wrote the notes that would become the wasteland. not a controlled, managed poem. A fractured, howling, magnificent poem about exactly what he'd been carrying. About the cost of the face. About what's underneath when the face finally drops. The poem didn't come from his strength. It came from his collapse. And here's what I want you to hold for a moment, because we'll come back to it, and it matters more than the literary history. The thing Eliot had been protecting behind all that performance, the thing he was terrified would be exposed if he dropped the face, was not disaster. It was a poet. It was the most important poet of his century. The performance had not been protecting him. It had been hiding him. You may be thinking, and it's a fair objection, that you are not T.S. Eliot. That your exhaustion doesn't have a literary product waiting on the other side of it. That if you let the face drop, what comes through might not be a masterpiece. It might just be a tired person in a quiet room with a lot of unresolved things. Fair, that's probably true. And it's also completely beside the point. Because the question isn't what comes through the collapse. The question is what you're protecting behind the performance, and whether it's still worth the cost. The dominant assumption about the mask, the one that self-help content never really challenges, is that we wear it to protect something fragile, some weakness, some inadequacy, some version of ourselves that can't bear scrutiny. The whole genre of vulnerability advice is built on this assumption. The mask is hiding a wound, and the wound needs to come out. Be more open, share your struggles. Strategic vulnerability, one post at a time. Eliot's diagnosis is different. Prufrock isn't hiding a wound, he's hiding a self. And those are not the same thing. The mask of competence that you've been wearing for 40 years isn't concealing your inadequacies. If anything, it's concealing your adequacy, the genuine depth, the earned judgment, the things you actually know. The performance is so complete that the people around you can't get to the real version of you, and neither can you. And here is where Eliot gets to something that the self-help genre cannot reach, because it requires both a broken life and a very long view to see it. In the years after the collapse, after Lausanne, after the wasteland, after the slow reassembly of a self that had been stripped down to something survivable, Eliot wrote what many consider his greatest work, not at 30, not from a position of managed competence. Four Quartets was written between his late 40s and his mid-50s. And in the second of the four poems, East Coker, he wrote the line that I want to put next to the coffee spoons and ask you to hold them together. The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. This is not a gentle thought. It is not the kind of humility that means self-deprecation, or knowing your place, or yielding to people who know better. Eliot is not telling you to make yourself smaller. He's making a structural claim about what survives. Competence is temporary. The performance is temporary. The face you've been preparing for 40 years is, in the deepest sense, temporary. And everyone who depends on it knows it, even if they can't say so. Humility, in the way Eliot means it, is not the opposite of strength. It's the thing that's left when the performance finally stops. It's the willingness to be seen as what you actually are, which is not less than the performance. It is, in almost every case, more. The mask does not fall when you get braver. It doesn't fall through strategic vulnerability or leadership training or the right therapist, though any of those might help. It falls when you stop believing the performance is what's keeping you safe. And that belief, that the face is load-bearing, that if you drop it, the whole structure collapses, is almost always wrong. It felt necessary at some point. It may have been necessary at some point, but the structure it was protecting has long since been built. And the face is now just the cost of maintenance on a building that would stand without it. If this is landing somewhere real for you, there's a guide in the description called The Second Half. It walks through what Eliot actually wrote in Four Quartets about time, starting over, and what he called the redemption of the past. Not as a motivational idea, but as a documented framework for people in exactly the stage of life he was in when he wrote it. It's for people who've done the first half and want to understand what the second one can hold. Links in the description. I want to close with a fact about Eliot's life, because I think it does more than anything I could argue. In 1957, Eliot was 68 years old. He had been famous for 4 decades. He had won the Nobel Prize. He had survived the breakdown, the terrible marriage, the years of performance. He had written everything he was going to write, and he married a woman named Valerie Fletcher, who had worked as his secretary and who was, by everyone who knew them, the person who finally got to see the face behind the face. He described the 8 years that followed as the happiest of his life. Not the most productive, not the most recognized, the happiest. The man who wrote Prufrock, The poem of the man who could not stop performing long enough to eat a peach ended his life in something that looked, by every account, like ease. Not the managed ease of someone holding it together. The real thing. He was 68. I don't know how old you are, but I'm willing to guess you're not done. The question worth carrying out of this video is not, should I be more vulnerable? That's the self-help version of the question, and it will send you right back into another kind of performance. The real question is simpler and harder. What am I protecting behind the face? And is it still worth what I'm paying? You don't have to answer it right now. You don't have to answer it out loud. But if you've been the strong one long enough to feel the cost in your body, in the quiet after a phone call you handled perfectly, that question is already asking itself. Eliot spent 30 years figuring out the answer. The coffee spoons were the measure of the cost. East Coker was the measure of what he found on the other side. If you've sat in a room after a hard conversation and felt the specific emptiness of having held it together for everyone but yourself, tell me how long you've been carrying it. I read everyone,